Blackwash, The Untold Stories of Reverse Racism. Written by Rodney Cloud Hill. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Introduction. Society should not attribute full blame towards individuals outside of political and educational positions of power for racist ideologies. The population should hold the system of institutional racism accountable for not portraying all humans as equal men and women, historically or presently. This represents entire cultures cast as inferior, while simultaneously presenting particular groups of people as the inventors and discoverers of everything prominently used in modern times. More so, this creates a false divine aura, with the persona that the dominant race has contributed nothing negative throughout history, while other races have contributed nothing significant. This way of thinking establishes a superior consciousness within the people of the positively portrayed race. For example, the concept of manifest destiny indoctrinated people into believing it was God's will to expand the United States throughout the American continents, being both reasonable and inevitable. This perspective resulted in the displacement and genocide of millions of Native Americans, as well as other indigenous ethnicities, for the expansion of European American lands. From a European perspective, one may see no issues in a nation with advanced weaponry presenting its capabilities. However, from an indigenous tribe's perspective, most of their civilizations were brutally wiped out without giving an initial violent justification. In other words, we must ask the question, where does morality begin and end when dealing with different ethnic groups coexisting in our world? The inability to address this issue through education globally is ultimately the cause of the generational inability to address racism. A person or a group of people portrayed as inferior means they have lost all hope for progression in the eyes of those who are convinced of their incapableness. Followers of this notion may believe that this is the lives of those impacted at a natural state, deserving of the difficulties plaguing their community. Some may even perceive people outside their race as disposable, the way many view insects. Fear is usually the association between these perceptions because personal interactions are not made. There are a multitude of problems with this connotation, preventing the forms of oppression and systemic racism from genuinely being addressed. Perspectives from minority or opposed races must be on the forefront of this discussion, which should be properly implemented into society's educational system. Presently in America, this phenomenon's psychological depths are misdiagnosed for jokes, name-calling, discrimination, stereotypes, and other forms of prejudice actions. Although these can be deadly, institutional racism and the association between people being oppressed systematically, physically, and psychologically should be the focus. To understand why they exist, we must examine history from different perspectives and factual events. Black people, indigenous Africans, and those of African descent have survived the atrocities of genocide in Africa from Europeans and Arabs, Western civilization's slavery, the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, apartheid, and today's oppressive agendas. The Ma'afa, or African Holocaust, happened globally, and black people have never received amends for these heinous actions, not even therapeutic solutions. Psychologically, these tragedies can affect the traumatized to feel inferior, deserving their conditions from their oppressors, and these effects can last for generations. Students are educated extensively about Hitler regarding his regime against the Jews in America's school system, but not on King Leopold II, who committed genocide towards roughly 10 million Africans in Congo. American public schools do not teach the extent of the massacres and ill treatment of black people and Native Americans that happened on U.S. soil. They fail to teach about Mansa Musa, an African king who lived roughly 700 years ago with the ability to throw off the world's economy with all the gold he possessed. The school system also excludes Queen Nzinga, an honorable leader who fought against the Portuguese and Angola and their expansion of African slavery for years in the 1640s. There have been a multitude of philosophers, scholars, inventors, scientists, doctors, architects, explorers, warriors, artists, musicians, etc., that originated from Africa. Africa has also established the first universities, educating vast nations of people. This continent has always influenced the world. Not being aware of the substantial knowledge that comes out of the cradle of civilization encourages the inability to view the culture as equal to Western civilization. However, Africans or African descendants, unaware of their own historical culture, will perceive themselves as inferior to other ethnicities. When a military service member goes to war, they can return home and be treated for psychological trauma if they witnessed ungodly actions during combat. This helps him or her reintegrate back into American society. These precautions are now taken as protocol, not only for military practices, but in society as a whole, following traumatic events. No such measures are implicated for the trauma inflicted on Africans, blacks, post-slavery. They were given nothing collectively for their contributions to America or the world, and instead were placed in poverty-stricken ghettos. These ghettos were economically burdened, educationally hindered, and had slim to no opportunities for survival. Even after slavery was abolished, the majority of Africans were initially shunned by most white people, and still looked upon as inhumane creatures. This thought pattern towards them pervasively persisted despite not doing anything destructive to receive the predominant race's adverse judgment. Today, African Americans are the primary targets for America's criminal justice system. Ultimately, worldwide, Africans have made it out of the depths of hell to be pushed right back in by systemic oppression and racism. This novel is by no means a generalization of everyone in a particular race, but it will explain why the oppressive conditions exist today. This novel also aims to address how people consciously or unconsciously contribute to systemic racism and oppression. It is not intended to be offensive, spark hatred within its reader, or hopes for returning cruelty upon the dominant race. However, it is intended to form a new perspective that is warranted for the healing of this country, as well as the rest of the world. Extensive research was conducted for writing this material. This novel reverses the narrative of oppression and systemic racism, hoping to gain empathy by using satirical schemes from factual events enforced on the subjugated, both past and present. The rhetoric of this novel is precise to the rhetoric that has been given towards the oppressed groups, all while unveiling a curtain that has never been presented before in this manner. Welcome to Blackwash, the untold stories of reverse racism. Chapter 1. First Contact. The Earth has sustained the ability to maintain human life in most regions of the planet for thousands of years. According to present-day science, the origins of humanity began in Africa. When the first humans migrated throughout the world due to climate, geographic, atmospheric, and weather distinction, humans developed biological differences based on where they inhabited. The 6 out of 7 continents that sustain humanity inhabit people who are all uniquely adapted to their location. There are few anatomical differences. However, physical ones are undeniably apparent. These minute differentiations have caused some cultures to create stigmatized perceptions towards others. Unfortunately, these perceptions are among the reasons many wage wars throughout history, establishing the need to dominate people based on their physical differences. Roughly 600 years ago, voyagers migrated from the continent of Africa in search of expanding their land. Chacha Kilombo was a Nigerian explorer who sought out to inhabit a new territory in hopes of becoming the ruler of his future discovery. In 1492, he stumbled across a region he believed was untouched by Africans after sailing the Atlantic Ocean with his crew for 6 weeks. This newly discovered territory, already inhabited by millions, was later named Shamarica in 1507. Shamarica's landmass is massive, much larger than all the nations in Africa individually, but it needed to be domestically civilized to be a prosperous country. Initially, Africans struggled to navigate the terrain. Also, since they were new to the environment, their bodies were not inoculated to illnesses prone in the land. Many died before learning how to treat these new sicknesses. Not knowing the dangerous animals and plants in the country caused casualties before gaining experience on how to survive as well. After weeks of creating settlements, the African pilgrims soon realized they were not the only humans inhabiting the land. The natives of Shamarica lived in villages close to fresh water. Their skin complexions were combined with a brown, yellow, and reddish hue. Their facial features and hair texture varied because some possessed similar traits to Africans, while others did not. The spiritual systems that natives practiced were close to those of Africans. However, the languages spoken were different. Some of the tribal garbs and physical customs bore a close resemblance to those of Africa as well. Africans believed that they harnessed a more advanced civilization based on the tools the natives were using. However, they knew the indigenous people were extremely knowledgeable in the necessary skill sets needed for survival in their homeland. Thus, learning how to communicate with them was vital for the Africans to survive this new land. Many of the indigenous populace were a peaceful culture and initially allowed Africans to create homes in Shamarica without attacking them. Africans and the natives began communicating with each other, sharing values, cultures, and establishing treaties. The natives also taught immigrants how to produce agriculture on the soil and hunt more efficiently. Unfortunately, their generosity came with a fatal price. Aside from the Africans becoming ill, they also introduced foreign diseases to the indigenous population. Smallpox would frequently break out among the tribes after contact was made between the two ethnicities, and violent conflict ensued. After receiving the necessary knowledge needed to survive, the Africans broke treaties and committed acts of genocide among the native people. Many battles happened throughout the decades, pushing tribes off the east coast of Shamarica and further west. Native Shamaricans used bows, knives, and other hand-wielding weapons during combat. Additionally, they were dominant in numbers because there were far more tribes in the regions than African pilgrims. However, Africans possessed more lethal weaponry since they developed gunpowder in their countries. Aside from ordinary battles using firearms, in 1763, the first usage of biological warfare was executed in Shamarica when Africans gifted blankets to tribes that were covertly infected with smallpox. These blankets played a significant role in the destruction of their civilizations. Colonizers then civilized more portions of the land, creating agendas of slave labor from those natives captured in battle. While and before African pilgrims were colonizing Shamarica, the continent of Europe was also becoming increasingly dominated and inhabited by African nations. African governments developed propositions to buy and sell Europeans for slave labor. Many nations, including Shamarica, took advantage of what became the most prominent business ever to exist. During the 15th century, upon exploring further into Europe, Africans realized how uncivilized the Caucasian people lived. They were dressed in wool with dull colors. From an African perspective, this type of clothing had no fashion sense, and it covered all the natural portions of the body symbolic of the highest divinity. The European lands were cold and destitute, reeking uncleanliness because bathing was not a routine hygienic practice in European culture. Food was scarce, not like the cradle of civilization, where nature provided bountiful natural fruits and vegetables. For Africans, adornment in jewels represented royalty among their bloodlines. The common European did not have any jewels hanging from their ears, eyes, necks, or mouths. Therefore, the lack thereof made Europeans easily identifiable as people with less prominent social nobility. It is a typical African belief that melanin within their skin is also connected to the intelligence within the universe. Melanin is responsible for pigmentation and is something that all things possess. It also acts as a defense mechanism fighting against harmful sun rays. However, noticing that Europeans had less melanin than them helped to justify treating them with cruelty. The Africans who were colonizing European lands thought they were superior in every way, primarily genetically. African institutions taught their people to believe that non-Africans possessed recessive genes. These recessive genes meant that if Africans had children with any other ethnicity, their children would possess more African features and a darker complexion than the other. It was also believed that Africans who mate outside their race would have unhealthy children. The European phenotype, pale skin, pointed noses, small lips, and fur-like hair, proved them to be inferior beings. Most of the men and women were slender compared to the strength and bone structure of the African physique. Africans were accustomed to some of their nation's populace having lighter complexions, blonde hair, blue or green eyes, although these men and women still possessed Africoid features. Instead, the creatures in Europe possessed traits similar to a beast. Caucasian tongue even spoke of savagery because their dialects were primitive and ignorant. Africans believed civilizing their culture was the only humane thing to do. Wealthy Caucasian families already possessed indentured servants, but many of their servants were treated as people of dignity or extended family members. Most of these individuals were captured in battle from enemy tribes or punishment for criminal activity before being enslaved. The latter would be similar to Shamarica's modern jail system. Slaves in Europe were able to speak their native languages, practice their own belief systems and cultures. Some Caucasian masters even allowed their slaves to read and write. The slaves could purchase their freedom by obtaining remunerations for their servitude. Furthermore, if slaves gave birth to children, they were not raised in bondage. However, Africans needed a solution for their economy far harsher than this treatment. Africans needed to be able to control the destiny of these individuals systematically. Chattel slavery would make African masters the primary owner over European life. There would be no reconciliation between the debt of a slave and their master. The children of slaves would also be in bondage. There was no code of conduct to care for European existence, because Europeans were perceived as inferior and created by God to be enslaved as property, not humans. During the African invasion of Europe, countries such as Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and Italy were already waging war. Spain was a nomadic nation and the easiest to conquer. Their land possessed fierce fighters, but they were primitive. The Crusaders of Congo traveled into Spain, killed off their warrior class, and pillaged their cities. They showed the Spaniards their capability of destruction if not complied with. The Congolese then came up with innovative strategies for dividing and conquering the land at a quicker pace. The strategy was to make bargains with the remaining Spanish leaders. These contracts stated those who helped capture other Europeans with them, they would no longer hurt or enslave their specific groups of people. Some European tribes continued fighting to their death, while others submitted to African domination. These deals made it easier to subjugate the rest of Europe and force obligations that would exploit resources from European countries, leaving the continent further in debt to African reign. The regions of northern Africa became the most populated countries with a European presence outside of Europe. This area is in such close proximity, naturally, it established more comfortable grounds for Africa's slave market industry. European slaves were transported throughout the continent, pleasing those who could afford to pay for their labor. Each country indoctrinated their cultures into the whites shipped there. This explains the present-day cultural assimilation of Caucasians whose heritage is from the same homeland, speaking different languages, and practicing different belief systems based on where the European diaspora brought them. For those slaves who had to travel further to reach their destination, conditions became worse. Africans established the largest slave port off the coast of France, where the most men, women, and children would be prepared to be shipped as lucrative commodities around the world. Africans would strip the Europeans of their humanity and force them into captivity. The process was splitting up families, separating languages and cultural practices. These strategies were conducted to remove them from their natural traditions and reduce the risk of rebellion. Europeans would be punished by death or severely beaten if caught conspiring plans to escape. Africans created manifests to keep the number of Europeans exported. It is documented that over 14 million people were captured and shipped to African nations over the span of 400 years. Only 9 million survived the Central Passage because of the harsh treatment or illnesses that spread on the boats. These numbers do not reflect the countless lives lost fighting against their captors in Europe. Europeans were treated like animals on these ships. They were stripped naked and fed small portions of food, barely keeping them alive. Their living conditions were planked on top of each other, or in small, compact rooms. Europeans would be forced to defecate, urinate, menstruate, and give birth on top of one another because of this. On the slave ships, Africans could rape the European women if they chose to. Some European males were also sexually violated in a practice called buck-breaking. This was to psychologically humiliate and instill African dominance in the minds of Europeans. Africans would also instill fear in Europeans by playing a game known as shark bait. Shark bait was accomplished by cutting through a captive's skin and tying them up at the end of a plank. Their blood would drip into the sea, while the sharks would circle around and try to eat them. The slave ship's conditions caused many illnesses, such as dysentery, plague, sexually transmitted diseases, and other prominent issues among the captured and crew members. Doctors accompanied the vessels administering aid, but they could not keep everyone alive during the relentless days of travel. Weekly, crew members would throw the dead over the ship decks by the hundreds. Also, some Europeans started riots because they would rather die than be in captivity. It is documented that many slave ships did not reach their destinations because Europeans overthrew them. The ships that had successful rebellions, where Europeans gained control, would return home or die trying to do so. Then there were those ships where the enslaved devised plans to do the same, but they would ultimately fail. These riots would kill several crew members aboard. Sadly, the failed attempts resulted in death for those individuals involved and sometimes even people who did not participate. African crew members who survived the riots had to make strong examples of what would happen if more Europeans tried an uproar. Then there were many who would rather commit suicide by jumping into the ocean and drowning than being enslaved. These weeks of travel would be a long, unhealthy, deadly, emotional, and a traumatic experience for the Europeans, but only a start to their new lives in Shamarica. Chapter 2. Civilizing the European. The year is 1619, and a new paradigm is being established in Shamarica. The Shango, Yamaya, and Oshun slave ships are among the first to arrive on the eastern shores. Africans were already occupying a portion of the land, bringing in agriculture, economy, and business for the settlers. Wealthy Africans were previously informed about the European commodity arriving this month, and were anticipating the purchasing of their new property. Plantations have already been constructed and prepared to be cultivated by their new slaves. When the ships docked, African settlers ran to the piers to view what was discovered. Initially, some of the crew members stepped off the boats and began to rally on the docks with their weapons, while telling the people to stand back. At first sight, the African settlers gasped in horror at the dreadful and barbaric nature of the European men, women, and children. Most of these Africans had never laid eyes on the Caucasian race. They were then dragged off the ships with chains around their necks, feet, or both. Some made attempts to escape, but they were impaled by the guards holding Nigerian blades. The men who tried to fight back were overpowered and tied to 2 horses, tearing them apart from opposite ends. This harsh example was clear to anyone who would not cooperate. The captives were whimpering, crying, and screaming in fear, while the Africans did not sympathize with the unavoidable condition in which the Europeans were placed. Europeans were initially grouped by men, women, adolescent boys, and adolescent girls. Secondly, grouping took place by hair color, eye color, and complexion. This was important for the psychological division into sectors of people. Auctioneers also needed to classify the men and women who were more physically fit than those who were not. Therefore, various instruments were used to make these assessments. The wealthy settlers would then purchase their property while forcefully rounding them up on carts for departure, preparing them for servitude at their new homes. The agriculture slaves cultivated in Shamarica mostly consisted of hemp, beans, bananas, rice, cowpea, okra, baobab, plantains, coconut, curry, wheat, ginger, yams, cannabis, coriander, cassava, cotton, and sugar. The livestock raised were cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, goats, and various fish species. For years there was a sudden influx of production coming from Shamarica due to slavery, making it a very prosperous country. Shamarica developed rapidly compared to other African nations dated before its colonization, because these nations did not use slavery as their prominent source of economy. Plantations in Shamarica were the hub of the commodity for the nation's people. Shamarican presidents, government officials, and political figures all owned slaves, but African plantation owners were among the nation's wealthiest families. These elite households also held powerful influence over political outcomes. Each European slave was given a new African name and the surname of whomever plantation owned them. European slaves worked around the clock on these plantations, only sleeping for 5 to 6 hours a day. Many people died because of these strenuous conditions. The average life expectancy for a slave at birth was 20 to 30 years, and newborn Europeans died twice as much on average than Africans. Slaves were given specific duties to complete, with their outcomes not only affecting the plantation, but all of Shamarica. Severe punishments were used to discipline those who did not finish a task, or did so incorrectly. The most prominent slave plantations were the Ode, Zulu, Igbo, Asha, Imana, Osa, Isa, Masai, Ida, and Bobo plantations. These plantations were mainly up and down the east coast of Shamarica. On plantations, the Europeans were only allowed to be taught African religions and traditions. Kemetic science, Ifa, Vodun, Yoruba, and other spiritual systems of African nations replaced the Europeans' previous customs. Aside from working, eating, and sleeping, attending religious services was the main pastime for slaves. This was one of the first institutions teaching them to be submissive towards their masters, instilling the Africans' superiority, many Europeans came to accept it was God's will for their captivity. Some of the religious teachings Europeans were accustomed to prior to their enslavement normalized suffering as virtuous based on the premise of receiving rewards in the afterlife. Those rewards required someone to be obedient while here on earth, so they would not experience a negative eternity. Most African religions preached reincarnation after death, but because of Europeans' prior belief systems, such as waiting on a savior to liberate them from their conditions on earth, many became easier to oppress psychologically. African slave masters made sure their property was not allowed to read or write, so that Europeans would remain ignorant about this world's knowledge. If the overseers were to catch any slave reading or writing, they would discipline them severely. The normal punishment for offenders was the removal of their tongue. Some were also killed to prove a more significant point, so others would not attempt to learn knowledge. Slaves also had a hierarchy of positions amongst them. The paler complexion Europeans with blonde hair and blue eyes were kept working in the fields. These slaves prepared the crops, tended to the animals, and built structures around the plantations. Their conditions were much harsher, and their treatment more inhumane than the slaves who worked in the house. Field slaves were forced to work in all climates to ensure their tasks were complete. They were beaten daily, fed scraps from the households, and given little water as they labored. The darker-complected European men with brown or black hair held higher respected positions. On some plantations, they were the overseers supervising the actions of the paler-complected, blonde-haired, blue-eyed slaves on the field. They were extensively trained, very obedient, and carried out the orders from their masters. Some of these overseers treated their European counterparts worse than Africans to prove their loyalty to the plantation. These darker slaves, especially the women, could hold positions in the house as cooks, entertainers, guest greeters, and cleaners. The house slaves could also be punished, killed, or raped, but their conditions were better than participating in strenuous labor outside. Ironically, regardless of the duties they tended to on their plantations, most slaves were forced to live in uncomfortable shacks away from the master's home. The circumstances of different treatment toward paler and darker slaves created a psychological rift within the slaves. Some lighter slaves envied the darker ones and hated the better treatment they received. They also started to feel inferior and less beautiful than the darker Europeans. In comparison, some darker-complected Europeans with black or brown hair believed that they were superior to the lighter ones. Sometimes, arguments or fights would break out between the populace of different complexions and result in consequences being harder on the lighter slaves. Unfortunately, this psychological form of separation and conditioning still exists amongst white communities in the present day, through a term known as colorism. On most plantations, African overseers were employed to monitor the fields. They carried weapons to discipline the slaves and prevent them from quitting, running away, or attempting rebellion. Usual punishments consisted of whippings for working ineffectively. Others were putting people in isolation cells with little or no food. Some men and women also had to wear a mask that had blades attached to it. These blades would slice their mouth if sudden movements were made. Runaways would be branded with their slave plantation's sigil or negative African symbols after being captured. Europeans would also have their feet cut off for not working productively or trying to run away. Castration was the punishment for male runners who were repeat offenders. These castrations would take place in front of their families or fellow slaves. Slaves could be tied up and burnt alive as punishment for their actions as well. Burying slaves at anthills with their heads protruding out of the ground while letting ants eat them slowly was punishment for those captured while trying to rebel. Some slaves were skinned alive and turned into fashion items such as shoes, clothes, purses, or wallets. Plantations destroyed the psychological image of the strong white male because there was nothing he could do to protect his family or himself from being dominated by the Africans. Women were sometimes given more respectable roles than male slaves. The darker-complected women with black hair could be allocated to positions in the house. They were also the nurturers or caretakers of African children. These duties consisted of doing laundry, cleaning, cooking, preparing the kitchen tables, and various other household chores. If needed, African masters would order pregnant Europeans to breastfeed the children of their owners. Slave women were commonly raped by the plantation masters, overseers, or distinguished visitors, making life for them a constant threat of being sexually violated. The rape cases increased drastically for women found to be attractive, as they had